All right, we're back with flip video number 2 for agriculture, which is how did agriculture evolve over time? And we're going to pick up essentially where we left off because our last flip video is discussing the first agricultural revolution, the origins of agriculture. Now we're going to take a look at is the second agricultural revolution because there are obviously tremendous differences between first agricultural revolution and that small scale domestication of plants and animals to our modern day, what's known as agribusiness. And so we'll take a look at how through this video. Our essential question: how has agriculture evolved over time? So, the first major shift and first major transition in the production of food globally came with the second agricultural revolution. I'm giving you a wide range of dates here. We're going to call this from 1750 to 1900. So, very wide range here. Reason being that the second agricultural revolution essentially was a large scale movement to achieve higher yields per acre. So, higher number of crops per acre. If you forgot what the word yield is, please put that on the left-hand side of your notes, and let's define that as the output. So, second agricultural revolution is a general movement to achieve higher yields per acre with the use of technology. I'm going to stop myself there before I continue this definition because it's important to remember that technology isn't just machines. You and I associate technology with Apple and Google and Facebook, things like that. But technology just can be more simplistically defined as anything that improves a process, anything that makes something easier. So that picture on the top left, that may not look like technology to you and I, but that early form of a plow is very much technology and very much improving the process of farming. So I'm giving you these very wide range of dates because the earliest transitions of the second agricultural revolution were just the utilization of technology. What really put this into high gear was the second agricultural revolution coincided means happened at the same time as coincided with the industrial revolution. So let's now read the whole definition considering that. Second agricultural revolution achieved higher yields per acre per area of land with technology, fertilizers, and industrialization of agriculture, and the improved collars for draft animals. Let's break this all down. Technology, we'll come back to that. But again, things that are tools that are making things easier. Fertilizers, better ways of tending to the crops and to ensure that they get the nutrients that they need and are able to, getting the nutrients that they need to feed the crops. Industrialization of agriculture, we're now looking at how technology is now being incorporated, specifically mechanization and machines are going to begin affecting agriculture. And this last one's a little bit specific, but still important. During the second agricultural revolution, we saw that there were improved collars for draft animals. Draft animals are animals that work, that are used. So I used a phrase in the last flip video, the beasts of burden. So working animals would need improved collars. That meant that they could pull much heavier loads and be much more productive, just generally speaking. This started the second agricultural revolution. I'm going to credit this in England because England is the beginnings of the industrial revolution, and the industrial revolution largely happened in England. Well, not largely, but one of the reasons being is they had an extensive river system, blah 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 stuff you can learn in history in your review. I shouldn't say learn. You'll review that in world history too. Um, but we're taking a look at how the mechanization of farming changed the agricultural production. So I'm going to actually take off this second bullet point because that also is a repetition. So generally speaking, what we're looking at here is we're looking at our how during the second agricultural revolution, this is really the introduction of mechanization of farming to use machines in farming. What that has created and has led to is sort of what these pictures at the bottom are portraying, which is the growth of industrial farming, using that the idea that farming is going to be a process involving machines and involving more than just a single farmer. That sort of all originated here with the second agricultural revolution. Um, mentioned this already, but you can copy this down now that this second agricultural revolution happened at the same time as the industrial revolution, which is really changing how all goods across the world were being produced, and agriculture certainly was not left out. Speaking a little bit more specifically, some of the examples of what began to change with the second agricultural revolution is we have greater technology. So we have threshers who can, I should do this different order. The reapers, which are able to take the crops off of better harvest the crops. The threshers, they can kind of shake the crop and make sure that the crop comes off the stalk. So just reducing the amount of work an individual has to do um, through the harvesting process. Combines is what you see on the top right there. That these can do all three in one. It can harvest the crop, it can thresh the crop, and it can do so on a large scale, as you see with that picture there. So technology, generally speaking, is just making agriculture, and I should back myself up. These threshers and reapers and combines, all of those didn't necessarily start off on the scale that you're seeing right there. They started off just like any technological advancement in much more simplistic, even handheld ways, and ultimately developed into the industrial agricultural machines that you see in the top right. Another important invention or important component of the second agricultural revolution was the changes to transportation. So the Industrial Revolution brought the creation of railroads and steamboats. And more specifically, what that meant is that these railroads and steamboats, as it pertained to agriculture, meant that food could now travel so much farther. I mean, this really revolutionized agriculture and really even where people could live, because now food, you're no longer limited to living in the proximity in the close range of a farm. The food can now be shipped in a much broader range, and this is also a opportunity for farmers to expand their reach as well. What's also important is this, the bottom picture shows us is that food, not immediately, but the development of refrigerated rail cars, was a huge advancement for the agriculture industry, because now food, I mean, this is really just transforming where the range that farmers had, that they now can sell their products on a much larger scale than they were able to do so before. So refrigerated car lines, though extremely expensive, and to this day still, it's a very expensive way to ship things, still an important, very key and important invention. Another thing to mention that was also increasingly common during the second agricultural revolution was the use of crop rotation. Now that term you see on the right hand side in the picture there, the term fallow, is essentially just to leave alone. So if you want to put fallow on the left hand side of your notes, to leave an area of land fallow is to leave it untouched, just to leave it alone. What this crop rotation is just exactly what it sounds like: rotating different fields for different crops in order to avoid exhausting the soil. So just kind of in a logical way, that if you keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, you're requiring the land to perform and to provide nutrients in the exact same way over and over again. By rotating and through three field crop rotation, and this is done in many different ways. And also, I should note, this has happened that ancient civilizations used this practice as well, but it expanded in scale after the Industrial Revolution and the second agricultural revolution. Three crop rotation, we're going to simply change which crop is being grown on which field, leaving one of those fields fallow for a period of time to allow the soil to replenish the nutrients. So just another change we saw in agricultural practices. So now that we see what the second agricultural revolution was, let's kind of step back for a minute. Let's put on the left-hand side of our notes the causes. The causes of the second agricultural revolution, for why it had the large-scale effects that it did, was because, one, the industrial revolution brought greater technology. So with greater technology, that meant that we have the better ability. People were more enabled. They were enabled, to begin improving their agricultural output. Secondly, the industrial revolution meant that more people were moving to the cities. People were moving to the cities because there are now more jobs available in the cities. There are now factories being built within the cities. That meant that as a society, we needed to provide more food to feed those factory workers. If the people were formerly in these rural areas and they are now moving to cities, then that meant there was a need. There was more technology that allowed it to happen, but there was also a much greater need to provide food for all these people who once lived in rural areas but are now living in the cities and working in the factories. The consequences of the second agricultural revolution On a more sort of logical level, when we had this more technology, we used greater technology, we used different farming techniques, we had more efficient farming and we had much higher yields of crops. That meant that we now have the food for the city workers. Another sort of byproduct, another consequence is that farms began to increase in size because as people began to become more efficient with their farming, that meant they were able to now farm a much larger amount of land, much larger amount of land with the same amount of labor. So, in other words, what one farmer was once able to do on a small area of land, he is now able to expand his farm to a much bigger size and with the same amount of, well, exerting the same amount of work himself because he now has all the technology that will allow him to still be economically productive. So causes, we've got this industrial revolution, the technology is there, and not only is technology there, but there's a great need to improve this the amount of crops that we're growing. Once we've done so, the consequences we got much more efficient farming, much higher yields. People in the city, people can now live in those cities effectively because we can provide the food for them. The technology, like the railroads and the steamboats, allowed us to get the food to them. And lastly, farms have now increased in size because they are now being more productive. That brought us through. So that was about 1750 to 1900. I want you to put in the back of your mind now, actually not in the back of your mind. Let's now consider, let's loop this right on back to our second unit of the study of population. Between that period of time, the 1750 to 19, I'm going to say 1940 here, as you well know, the population began to skyrocket. In particular, we skyrocketed in the least developed countries. Well, I should say no, global population change. But one of the areas of the world experiencing a lot of that change were the least developed countries of the world. The Industrial Revolution was mostly effective in the countries that are now, well, let's back that up. The population changes around the world created tremendous consequences across the world, and the countries that were most directly experiencing the industrial revolution in the mid 1800s to early 1900s were developing all kinds of different technologies to expand their societies. Let's fast forward here. The third agricultural revolution began in the 1940s and generally lasted through the 1970s. What this meant is that in this period of time, the most developed countries of the world began to ship their technology or provide their technology to the least developed countries of the world to feed their growing populations. What this, in a more practical level, what the third agricultural revolution was, is that between the second agricultural revolution and the third agricultural revolution, the most developed countries of the world had created some tremendous agricultural advancements that improved the yields, improved the quality, improved all kinds of components about agriculture, while the least developed countries and the developing countries of the world were still using some of the early agricultural technologies introduced in the second agricultural revolution. This revolution, the third agricultural revolution, is also known as the Green Revolution. This meant in a more specific sense is that fertilizers, artificial fertilizers, so there are fertilizers that are natural and there are fertilizers that are chemical. Artificial fertilizers, better irrigation techniques, pesticides, genetically modified organisms, mechanical machinery, crossbreeding, and hybridization. I'm going to talk about all of those. These different techniques were all began with the most developed countries of the world began to implement those techniques in some of the least developed countries of the world. So irrigation techniques, meaning that let's put that on the left-hand side if we're not too sure what that means. Irrigation techniques bringing water to areas where farming was previously unable to be done because without specific systems for bringing water, you can't just farm anywhere. Pesticides, of course, I mean, they're natural pesticides and they're chemical pesticides. Many of the least developed countries were facing problems with many of their crops dying as a result of pests, problem that continues to this day. And MDCs began providing LDCs with very targeted pesticides. Genetically modified organisms, that was introduced a little bit later in this third agricultural revolution, but these GMOs were as they were developed, began to be implemented in some less developed countries to increase higher yields to create drought-resistant crops and to create crops that were better able to resist pests. Mechanical machinery, of course, just providing the different technology and the machines to improve agriculture in the LDCs. Crossbreeding and hybridization, essentially just creating and different, stronger and better crops, varieties of crops through hybridization, taking one and the other and creating a stronger crop. What this meant, this guy named Norman Borlaug, he's basically considered to be the father of the Green Revolution because it was his variety of wheat that really drove this Green Revolution. So we had high yield rice and wheat varieties that began to be used globally, particularly in India and Mexico. As you see here, India was the rice production, Mexico was the wheat production. A lot of the success from this came from Norman Borlaug's version of the wheat that he created that was actually drought resistant and better able to resist pests. But most of the success of the Green Revolution in Mexico and in India was based upon the use of fertilizer to help support the crops. The Green Revolution, exporting these technologies and these different processes from MDCs to LDCs, it basically saved India from famine. I mean, India was on the verge of, with their enormous population growth, we're facing tremendous conflicts feeding, or problems feeding their population. And the Green Revolution basically saved India from famine initially. And it also helped fuel development both in Mexico and in India. Similarly provided results in Mexico, but India had such a tremendous population boom that they kind of had a more dire need for the Green Revolution at the time. With the Green Revolution, there's a mixed bag of results. Whether a Green Revolution was a positive or negative change is debatable. Let's talk first about the positive effects and why it's largely supported. This enormously increased wheat production. So this is a chart or graph. Actually, let me move this up a little bit so you can see our years. This drastically increased wheat production around the world, especially in these MDCs. LDCs. So if we're looking at the wheat production in India, Pakistan, and Mexico in 1950, so really kind of at the early cusps of the Green Revolution, very low production. We can see Mexico has skyrocketed in their ability to provide wheat. That means, on a really basic level, that means more money for the farmers. They can sell the wheat and provide for themselves. Also, in a very basic level, it feeds people, feeds both the farmer and the people that are buying the wheat. So this alone is a tremendously important consequence. It also increased the calories that were available per person. So not only are people not starving, but when you have greater access to crops like wheat and rice, there's a greater calorie consumption, which leads to just generally better nutrition for people. It also provided a more diverse diet in some senses because people were able to eat more food. There's also kind of a minor but still important consequence was that when the Green Revolution began to make farming more efficient in some of the LDCs, that means that the plot of land that was used to grow, let's just hypothetically say one farmer was using 1 acre and he was getting 10 bushels of wheat. Well, if that farmer is now growing with these agricultural technologies and he can now produce 150 bushels of wheat from that same 1 acre, that means that farmer doesn't need to expand his land. That means that essentially we're saving land, we're preserving some of the land, such as forests that would have otherwise been cut down to create more land, more room for farmland. So, in some senses, this is a little bit like kind of a conservation technique. Or not, I shouldn't say technique, but a consequence is some of the preservation of land, the conservation of land. Because of irrigation, the irrigation, again, is creating ways to provide water for areas that are otherwise too dry for farming. This now, places that don't have particularly high rainfall, we're now able to farm, and that's not a small consequence. That's important, and that sort of, in some senses, empowered different groups of people to provide for themselves. So lots of positives. The one that's not listed there, but we just basically know, is that people were able to eat and better able to provide for the country was better able to provide food. You can see here, this is just another graph there. The IR8 is actually the version of the rice that was one of the that was used during the Green Revolution. So you can see that rice, it says kilocalories per capita. Rice and wheat, you can see how many calories that actually. And then this is, calories are often discussed in a negative sense, like you want to avoid calories, but calories are energy. Calories are what you and I eat food specifically to do, which is to live. So, rice and wheat for lesser developed areas of the world, and just actually anywhere in the world, they're going to provide better nutrition than you can see some of the potatoes or vegetables, even corn. Much fewer calories, and therefore people aren't eating quite as well. You can see, I'm going to read the caption there, that rice is one of the most important food crops in the world, providing more energy to humanity than any other food source. Yet rice yields have more than tripled since 1961, which is keeping up with Asia's growing population. So, as Asia's population continues to increase, then the need for caloric foods like rice and wheat too increases. However, the Green Revolution didn't come without criticism. One of the key things that people criticize the Green Revolution for is the loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is just the diversity of biological organisms. Many people criticize, saying that when farmers are only growing these high yield crops, such as rice and wheat, that they're actually we're losing some of the diversity of crops and diversity of food that was once present in that region. A lot of people, another very common criticism of the Green Revolution is that it's expensive to maintain, that the machinery necessary and what I'd call the infrastructure. So infrastructure just sort of means the processes, the machinery, the whole system of using the Green Revolution techniques in a least developed country of the world are very expensive, and it's not a organic process. In other words, it's not coming necessarily from the resources available in that place. It must be brought in, and that isn't necessarily all bad, but that does mean that the country must then depend upon the most developed countries of the world to provide that. That's changing over time, but that was some of the initial criticism. And I mean, it still reigns true, but there's many of the least developed countries, they're now sort of developing countries. So, for example, Mexico and India are now increasingly able to provide that infrastructure. Um, but it certainly can't be denied that many of the seeds that are used, or maybe a lot of the technology that's used, is more expensive. A lot of people also cite the Green Revolution for causing environmental damage. So some say that there's groundwater contamination in areas, which is not always, but which is a consequence of using different most developed country techniques. There's also some unintended. Some people also argue for the unintended consequences of introducing foreign varieties. So, for example, taking a good that is not natural to one environment and beginning to farm that crop in a new area. Some people often criticize these techniques because there are many they argue that there are many unintended consequences for introducing a crop that is not native to one specific place. Desertification, and I'm sorry, I don't have the definition there. Desertification is when the land is no longer fertile and essentially becomes a desert. So this is desertification was one of the criticisms in certain areas when they've sort of exhausted the soil, that the land was no longer fertile. But that's really sort of a minor consequence specifically associated with the Green Revolution. One of the other things that other people cite is that many people argue this is disempowering the farmer, that the farmer is now not necessarily as in control of their own crops and their own farm and their own farming decisions as they once were when they were growing things on a smaller scale. But something just to keep in mind, or something to kind of frame the discussion around. So these things were all the criticisms of the Green Revolution are valid, the benefits of the Green Revolution are valid. But one of the arguments and one of the things that we're going to explore a little bit is that as the future of our Earth, as the population of our Earth continues to skyrocket. I mean, we're looking here that in 1927 we had 2 billion people. In 1960, when the Green Revolution started to happen, we had 3 billion people. We're here in 2015. We are in 7 billion people. We're going to very soon be reaching 8 billion people. So we have to consider this is a tough question facing our world, is how do we continue to feed our world and utilize effective agricultural techniques all across the face of the earth while still maintaining environmental consciousness and things that are affecting the environment. This is something that the National Geographic magazine did a really cool series, and that's actually why we went to go to that National Geographic Museum exhibit, is because it's all about food and the future of food. And I'm going to give one of your analysis questions to take a look at this in greater detail, because this slide right here discusses some of the very specific technologies that allowed the Green Revolution to occur and what it meant for the Green Revolution to occur. And this next slide is when National Geographic is suggesting some of the techniques that can be used to further drive benefits. So they're calling this a greener revolution, about how we need to, we're not going to get more earth. There's not going to be more land. So what is it that we can do to better increase crop yields and to better provide for our world and our environment? So there it is. We got our first, second, and third agricultural revolutions. Here are your analysis questions, and it looks like I have one that is cut off here. So I'm going to pause this video, fix that, and then you can go ahead and pause the questions and answer these. All right, there we are. So here are your questions. Again, I mentioned number 4. It says, return to the National Geographic Green Revolution costs and benefits slides. That slide, that's the first one I mentioned that shows how the Green Revolution occurred in the early 1960s. All righty, thanks.